There is this really profound paradox about the era we live in right now,
Oh, absolutely.
and it's something you can feel just walking down the street.
Mm.
Because on one hand, we are surrounded by an absolute, unprecedented level of material abundance. I mean, think back to the sheer unadulterated joy of unboxing a brand new gadget, or for those who remember the 90s, the global, almost utopian party that was the launch of Windows
Yeah,
95's.
that was wild.
We have access to basically any piece of information, any song, any product we want delivered to our doors almost instantly.
Right, the sheer volume of entertainment and experiences and just consumer goods available to the average person today would be historically staggering to anyone living even like a century ago.
Exactly. But then there's this really dark flip side to that abundance.
Hmm?
Because on the exact same day you're ordering same-day delivery from a supercomputer in your pocket, you might read a tragic news story about, say, a 73-year-old immigrant construction worker dying on a job site because he simply couldn't afford to retire.
Yeah, it's jarring.
It really is. We have this mountainous accumulation of wealth, yet so many of us, even in the wealthy global north, are just plagued by overwhelming precarity, burnout, and stress.
Which is arguably the defining tension of our modern lives, you know? How can a society be so unbelievably wealthy on paper, yet so structurally stressful for the people actually living in it?
That is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are going to explore this question by unpacking a fascinating set of academic notes, specifically a document titled Unit 5, Where Does All the Stress Come From? We're going to travel back in time to trace the rise of an economic operating system called neoliberalism.
Right?
And we'll look at how it completely rewired our society, our cities, and the very concept of the middle class. A lot of people did not think we would end up in such a stressed out, precarious place. I mean, there was this famous idea coined by the political scientist Francis Fukuyama called the end of history.
Right. The premise there was that with the fall of the Soviet Union, liberal democracy and free market capitalism had decisively won. They had permanently solved the world's major problems.
Wow.
Yeah, the idea was that the big, messy ideological battles of the 20th century were over and humanity was just sailing into a reasonable, prosperous, and frankly uneventful future.
But the reality of the 1990s and the 2000s completely shattered that illusion. Instead of a peaceful victory lap, we sailed right into our current era of massive instability, gig work, and rolling financial crises. So if the 90s dream of a peaceful end of history failed, what actually took over?
Well, that's the core question.
Okay, let's unpack this. The notes keep referring to neoliberalism as the operating system of our era. My instinct is to just equate that word with capitalism, but the source is pointing to something much more specific, isn't it?
It is much more specific. The notes lean on the geographer David Harvey's definition, which frames neoliberalism as a distinct political ideology.
Okay.
It's basically the belief that human welfare is best advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms within a framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade.
So getting the state out of the way.
Sort of, yes. Now, the roots of this go back to thinkers like Friedrich Hayek after World War II, but it really gained traction as a direct counterattack against the post-war social democratic consensus.
The system that built the mid-century middle class.
Precisely. After World War II, you had strong unions, high taxes on the wealthy, and a lot of state intervention in the economy. But in the 1970s, the global economy suffered massive shocks.
Like the oil crises.
Yeah, exactly. You had the Nixon shock, where the U.S. severed the dollar's convertibility into gold, turning it into a fiat currency and destabilizing global finance. Then you had the OPEC oil crises, which caused massive inflation and stagnating growth.
Right, stagflation.
Exactly. A brutal combination. Profit margins for the elite plummeted, they panicked, and they needed a new operating system to restore their class power. That operating system was neoliberalism.
You know, what I found so compelling in these notes is how the culture actually softened the ground for this massive economic shift. The source argues that the post-WWII middle class became so incredibly comfortable, so thoroughly pacified by their new suburban lives, that pop culture literally projected their lifestyle backward onto the Stone Age.
Oh, the Flintstones example.
Yes. I mean, think about the cartoon The Flintstones. You have cavemen living in suburban single-family homes, driving cars, using dinosaur appliances, and working traditional 9-to-5 jobs.
It's a brilliant observation by the author.
It completely normalized the nuclear consumerist family as this eternal, biological, natural state of humanity. It told the public, Like, this is how things have always been, and this is how they always will be.
And that cultural pacification had a fascinating intersection with the counterculture of the 1960s.
Wait, how so?
Well, we usually think of the hippie movement as this radical, left-wing, anti-establishment force, right?
Sure.
But the text argues that, fundamentally, the 60s counterculture adopted a highly individualist agenda. The focus shifted away from neighborhood solidarity, class struggle, or collective labor rights. Instead, it became entirely about individual self-actualization.
Oh.
Finding yourself, personal liberation, expressing your unique identity.
Which inadvertently disarmed the public. By making the ultimate goal of life about your personal spiritual journey, rather than, say, organizing your workplace, the public became completely atomized.
Exactly.
When the elites started pushing through massive neoliberal reforms in the 1980s, busting unions, privatizing public assets, it was so much easier because the culture had already weakened the muscle of collective resistance. Everyone was too busy focusing on their individual freedom.
Yeah. And to understand how this new, highly individualized neoliberal state operates in practice, the source provides a fantastic metaphor. Let's compare the classical liberal state of the 19th and early 20th centuries with the neoliberal state of today.
Okay, lay it on me.
Classical liberalism wanted the nation to operate like a factory. They wanted a small state and low taxes on production because their ultimate dream was to be the world's leading producer of tangible, valuable goods.
Then a factory needs workers. It needs infrastructure, roads to move the goods, and at least a baseline level of health for the people operating the machines.
Right. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, operates more like an exclusive nightclub.
A nightclub.
Yeah. Under this model, a country doesn't necessarily need heavy industry. It doesn't need to produce anything tangible at all. It just needs to offer an exclusive, secure environment to attract foreign investors.
Oh, wow.
The text uses Spain as a prime example, shifting its entire economic focus toward real estate, mass tourism, and EU membership. Foreign capital flows in to buy a spot in the VIP section, making the club more valuable, which in turn attracts more investors. The state doesn't care if the economic activity is practically productive for society as long as it brings cash through the door.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here. If the neoliberal nightclub is all about the free market, deregulation, and letting capital flow freely without government interference, why does the source say it requires a massive, well-funded state apparatus? I mean, isn't the whole point of a free market that it naturally regulates itself?
That is the central contradiction the author highlights. Maintaining this highly unequal nightclub actually requires heavy state funding, specifically for strong police forces, the military, and high-tech surveillance.
Really?
Yeah. The free market, in this context, isn't a natural state of being. It requires muscle to enforce it. A nightclub is fundamentally exclusionary. To keep the VIPs safe and comfortable, you need bouncers at the door.
So the state becomes the bouncer.
Precisely. The state exists to protect private property and market stability above all else, even if it means neglecting the citizens. The source uses the pop culture example of Breaking Bad.
Oh, I love that show.
Right, so Walter White is a man whose basic healthcare needs were completely failed by the system. As a result, he turns to the black market and ends up destroying the social fabric of his community by building a drug empire. Or, on a more systemic level, look at the Spanish Preferentes banking scandal after the 2008 financial crisis.
Right, right. That was the scandal where major banks systematically cheated vulnerable, often elderly people out of their life savings by selling them incredibly complex, toxic financial products.
Yes, and when the public realized what had happened and that their money was gone, the state didn't mobilize to dismantle the banks. Instead, they needed a massive police presence to protect the bank branches and the bankers themselves from individual or collective vendettas by the citizens.
Yes.
The state's primary role was protecting the financial institution. The text even mentions a glaring, literal example: the Filomena snowstorm in Madrid.
Oh man, that blew my mind. The entire city of Madrid was paralyzed by record-breaking snow. And the public library in the Retiro Park, a vital community resource, was closed for 45 days.
Yeah.
But the city mobilized its resources to clear the paths to the Florida Park, a set of luxury privately owned bars inside that same park, opening them in just 2 weeks.
Exact.
The priority of the state is always keeping the cash flowing in the VIP section.
So, if we step back from the nightclub, we have to ask, how did this specific operating system actually take over the globe? It didn't happen overnight. Our source maps this out narratively, showing a domino effect across 5 distinct phases.
Let's trace that timeline, because it really explains how we got here.
It starts in the late 1960s and early 1970s with what the author calls the worrying signs. The massive economic boom that followed World War II starts to sputter. Profit margins for corporations shrink, and the Nixon shock destabilizes the global currency system.
Okay, so that's phase one.
Right. And that anxiety among the elite leads directly into phase two, the crisis, spanning roughly 1973 to 1979.
This is when the old tools stopped working. Keynesian economics, the idea that the government can just spend money to boost demand and fix the economy, completely fails to stop the stagflation caused by the OPEC oil shocks.
Exactly. And because the old tools failed, elites started looking for radical alternatives. They found them in the free market theories of the Chicago School of Economics, but they needed a place to test them. And they got their first testing ground in Augusto Pinochet's Chile following a violent U.S.-backed military coup in 1973. They used brutal state violence to enforce extreme free market deregulation. Around the same time, you have Deng Xiaoping beginning to open China's state-run economy to capitalist markets.
Which sets the stage for phase three, the takeover, running from 1979 to 1991.
Right.
The experiments move from the periphery to the core. This is the era of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US. They win the political battles, they crush the labor unions, they slash taxes for the wealthy, and they push aggressive privatization.
Yep, sweeping changes.
And the ultimate psychological victory happens in 1991 with the fall of the USSR. Suddenly, neoliberalism looks like the only viable option left for humanity.
Which ushers in phase four. Consolidation from 1992 to 2007. This is the era you mentioned at the beginning, the 90s abundance. During this period, the rules of neoliberalism are literally hardwired into global international law.
Through trade agreements and stuff.
Exactly. You have the Maastricht Treaty formalizing these economic rules in Europe and the creation of the World Trade Organization to enforce free trade globally.
But all of that deregulation builds up a massive amount of hidden risk, leading us right into phase five, the crisis. The 2008 Great Recession.
Big one.
The housing bubble bursts, reckless financial speculation brings the global economy to its knees, and the illusion of endless stable growth is shattered. And the irony is, the governments had to step in and use taxpayer money to bail out the very banks whose free market ideology caused the crash in the first place.
Throughout that entire timeline, the engine driving the system forward is a relentless process of commodification. It's the mechanism of taking things that were never meant to be bought and sold and transforming them into financial products.
Right.
The notes give this incredible, tangible anecdote about a Real Madrid football shirt.
I love this example because it makes a highly academic concept so visual. Historically, a football shirt was just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol of athletic loyalty, a way to show you belong to a local community or a specific neighborhood team.
Yeah.
But the neoliberal mindset looks at the blank chest of a football shirt and is almost offended by it because it sees unexploited real estate.
It sees a missed financial opportunity.
Right. So the system does three things. First, it valorizes that empty space, assigning a monetary value to the visibility. Second, it monetizes it by slapping a massive corporate sponsor like the airline Emirates right across the chest.
Right.
And third, it privatizes the profits, funneling the money to the club's wealthy owners or shareholders rather than the local community. It has gone to such an extreme that today, players are often contractually banned from giving their sweat-soaked match shirts to young fans in the stands.
Because the club's administration wants to take that exact match-worn shirt, put it online, and auction it off to the highest bidder anywhere on the globe. It is the absolute financialization of everyday life and emotion.
You know, it's like inviting a close friend over to your house for dinner, cooking them a meal, but then handing them a bill for a rental fee for the dining room chair they were sitting on.
That's hilarious.
It takes a fundamental social bond, a moment of human connection, and ruthlessly turns it into a financial asset to be leveraged.
That is a perfect analogy for how commodification alters human relationships. And the text provides a broader macroeconomic metaphor for this exact dynamic. The train.
Oh, this is grim.
Yeah. The author acknowledges that, yes, neoliberalism defeated the communist bloc, and yes, it boosted global GDP and created massive, unprecedented wealth for those who could participate in the markets. But it did so at a terrible hidden cost. When the capitalist train ran out of coal, when traditional productive growth slowed down, it didn't stop. It started ripping up its own wooden floorboards to burn in the engine just to keep moving forward.
Burning its own floorboards.
Wow.
Just consuming the very foundation it rides on.
Exactly. It creates a massive burst of short-term energy that looks absolutely fantastic on a quarterly GDP chart. But It completely sacrifices long-term societal survival.
Right.
It's like looking at an ancient biodiverse forest and treating it purely as timber to be chopped down and sold today, completely ignoring its long-term value as an ecosystem that produces oxygen and stabilizes the climate. The result of burning the floorboards, as economists like Thomas Piketty have extensively documented, is the skyrocketing wealth inequality we see today.
So we've seen how the macroeconomy burned its own floorboards to keep the GDP numbers up. But how did that actually affect you, the listener, in your daily life? How did it change the dynamic inside the home? Because this brings us right back to the overwhelming stress we talked about at the very beginning.
This is what the source refers to as the shift to the second middle class society effect.
Okay, break that down for us.
In the first generation, right after WWWI, the middle class was built on the idea that the state guaranteed your basic safety. You had strong public services, subsidized housing, robust labor rights, and a cultural sense of what the author calls state fetishism, this belief that the government was a paternal figure ensuring your survival.
But the neoliberal revolution flips that dynamic entirely. It replaces state fetishism with market fetishization. It brings the ruthless logic of financialisation directly into the domestic economy of the household.
Completely.
Suddenly, your family's well-being doesn't depend on state guarantees or a secure pension. It depends entirely on how well you can manage your private assets, your stock portfolio, or your mortgage. The state effectively steps back, points at the market, and says, "You are on your own. Good luck."
And the psychological toll of that is immense. The notes use a great pop culture reference to illustrate this. The character Belén from the popular Spanish sitcom Aquí no hay quien viva.
She is the absolute quintessential example of this new, modern precarity.
She really is. She's living in one of the richest, most technologically advanced periods of Spanish history. Yet, she is constantly visibly stressed. She is in a perpetual, exhausting rush just to escape poverty.
Right. She's constantly jumping between terrible temporary jobs just to scrounge up enough cash to pay the bills for her flat. She's living away from her family, sharing a space with an ambitious flatmate who is equally stressed out.
Yeah.
It's the perfect distillation of the era. You are forced to act like a ruthless private corporation, constantly hustling and managing your brand just to survive the month.
To see how deeply this goes, let's look at three of the core pillars of life and how they were completely transformed by this shift. Let's start with the homeowner.
Okay.
In the mid-20th century, a house was primarily viewed as a basic human need for shelter, and state policies encouraged homeownership to create social stability. Under neoliberalism, the house was transformed into an engine for property speculation. Deregulation allowed banks to hand out complex mortgages, turning homes into financial casino chips, which is exactly the mechanism that triggered the 2008 crash.
Right. And then you have the second pillar, the guaranteed worker.
Yeah.
We completely moved away from the Fordist model.
The old school factory floor guarantee.
Exactly. The Fordist model gave you an 8-hour shift, a steady paycheck, and a union-backed pension. We moved from that straight into absolute precarity. We saw the rise of what anthropologist David Graeber famously called shit jobs, basically meaningless, insecure labor.
Yeah.
People are increasingly forced into autonomo or freelance status in the gig economy. They take on all the financial risks of a business owner, paying their own taxes and health care with absolutely none of the security or benefits.
Which raises an incredibly dark question. How do people cope with this total evaporation of economic security?
How do they?
The source explicitly links the structural precarity to the massive explosion of online poker, sports betting, and crypto speculation among the working class. When the state removes your actual economic guarantees, it offers you the illusion of financial freedom instead. It sells the desperate hope that with one lucky bet or one viral moment, you can permanently trade your way out of the working class.
Wow. And then there's the third pillar, the graduate. We transitioned from a system that at least aspired to meritocracy into one of deep structural segregation.
Yep.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate here. The source uses an anecdote about fourth ESO students. Basically, 15 and 16-year-olds in a Spanish high school being segregated into different classrooms based on academic tracks.
Right, tracking.
You have an advanced math and bilingual track and a basic track. The notes observe that the top tracks get all the high grades while the basic tracks fail completely. But isn't a school just trying to logically tailor its education to different skill levels so kids aren't left behind? Why does the source view this as a systemic failure?
It's a very common and very logical sounding defense of academic tracking. But the source asks us to look at the underlying mechanism of how that tracking actually functions in society.
Yeah.
When you segregate students this way, you aren't just sorting by raw intelligence. You are overwhelmingly grouping students who already possess systemic advantages. Kids whose parents have more time to read to them, who have higher cultural capital, or who can afford private tutoring into one room, they reinforce each other's success.
That makes sense.
Conversely, you group all the struggling students who often face complex socioeconomic issues at home together in another room. This normalizes chaos and low achievement.
Which triggers the anti-Pygmalion effect. If a teacher walks into a room of kids officially labeled the slow track, the teacher consciously or subconsciously lowers their expectations and effort.
Exactly.
The kids internalize that, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy confirming they are failures.
Precisely. The source argues this is the exact moment a public good education gets infected by private company logic. A corporation segments its audience into premium clients who get the best service and basic clients who get the bare minimum. Applying that logic to a public school dramatically widens the inequality gap right at the starting line of life. But it is politically justified using the classic neoliberal language of providing freedom of choice for families.
So if applying this market logic to housing, to work, and even to high school classrooms inevitably widens the gap, what is the ultimate result? The source argues that these changes haven't just made us poorer, they have actually created three brand new axes of inequality that define the architecture of our modern world.
Yes, three distinct divides. The first is property.
Right.
Whether you own assets, specifically real estate, fundamentally determines whether you are safely inside the VIP nightclub generating passive income or stuck outside in the cold paying ever-increasing rent. The second axis is native condition.
The passport lottery.
Basically, because global wealth has been intensely concentrated in the metropolises of the global north, simply being born with a passport from a wealthy country gives you immense legal and economic power over the migrants who are brought in to do the actual physical labor that keeps those cities running.
And the third axis is generation. This is the divide creating so much visible tension right now. Older generations were able to buy up property during the post-WWII boom when it was incredibly cheap, and now they are economically incentivized to hoard those assets to fund their retirements.
While the youth get left behind.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the youth are statistically dispossessed. They face stagnant wages and exorbitant housing costs, leaving them with almost zero hope for the kind of upward social mobility their parents enjoyed.
Which perfectly explains why the percentage of people who even statistically identify as middle class is shrinking every year. The widespread social unrest, the anxiety, the political polarization we see globally right now, none of this is a glitch or an accident. It is a feature of a system where the floorboards have been burned and the economic future has effectively been canceled for the youth.
So bringing this all back to you, the listener, if you have ever felt completely overwhelmed by the relentless grind of the gig economy, if you've looked at the housing market and felt a deep sense of existential dread, or if you're just exhausted by the constant pressure to manage your personal brand online, this deep dive shows that your stress is not a personal failing.
You haven't done something wrong.
Right. You are navigating a system that was deliberately historically constructed over decades. A system that took the old comfort of state security and replaced it with market survival. It is a system that demands that you, a single mortal human being, operate with the ruthless efficiency and risk tolerance of a multinational corporation.
And that leaves us with a critical, frankly urgent dilemma. If neoliberalism is a train that has been burning its own floorboards since the 1970s just to keep its engine running, and the 2008 financial crisis showed us that we are rapidly running out of wood, what powers the engine next?
Yeah.
When the roof of the nightclub finally caves in because the societal foundation has been entirely hollowed out, what will we do? Will we find a way to work together to build a new factory, a new system based on actual collective value and sustainability? Or will the bouncers just start charging double for the VIP section while the rest of the club burns to the ground?
That is the defining question of our time. So the next time you walk through your city, take a really close look around. Look beyond the convenience and the abundance. Look at who actually owns the buildings. Look at who is doing the gig work, delivering your packages, and see if you can spot the nightclub bouncers hiding in plain sight. They are everywhere once you know what to look for.